In everyone's life, there comes a moment when they realize that the secret to success lies in an unexpected place, the ability to let go. This seemingly paradoxical idea overturns conventional notions of achieving goals and striving for happiness. All our lives, society teaches us to fight for our dreams, to persistently pursue them. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if it is precisely the excessive attachment to the outcome that becomes the very obstacle preventing harmony in relationships, success in careers, and inner peace? Carl Jung, the eminent psychologist, asserted that the more a person tries to control their life, the further it slips away. And today, we will explore why the ability to let go can be the key to genuine freedom. It is important to stay until the end because changing your perspective can drastically alter your life. The tighter we cling to our preconceptions of how things should be, the faster what we desire eludes us. Attachment, intended to provide a sense of security, often turns into disappointment. The paradox lies in the fact that when we relinquish control, life begins to breathe fully. Jung said, "What you chase runs away. What you accept transforms." In the modern world where effort, control, and the relentless pursuit of success are cultivated, tranquility seems to remain an unattainable goal. However, it is precisely this obsessive desire for everything to be exactly as planned that prevents the emergence of something authentic and valuable. This is not about surrendering to circumstances or embracing all-encompassing indifference, but about a more complex and delicate process, stepping out from under the yoke of total control and transitioning into a state of deep self-awareness. Carl Jung, who dedicated his life to studying the depths of the human psyche, left us with a valuable key to understanding this transformation. In his view, detachment is not a manifestation of emotional insensitivity, but a necessary psychological maneuver performed by our ego. The ego must free itself from the shackles of its own projections to allow something authentic and real to manifest. In other words, as long as we are entirely consumed by what we project onto the surrounding world, whether it be specific people, our innermost desires, or idealized visions of the future, we are deprived of the opportunity to see the true picture of what is happening within ourselves. It is perfectly natural that we strive for success in our endeavors and desire that everything turns out for the best. However, the problem arises when our self-identification becomes inextricably linked to the achieved result. When we begin to identify ourselves with success, believing that I am my success, or see relationships merely as a means of gaining recognition. In such moments, failure, loss, or even the silence of another person is perceived as an existential threat. It is from this deep-seated fear that anxiety, worry, and desperate attempts to control every aspect of one's life arise. Jung argued that this state of continuous tension is nothing more than a manifestation of the ego's efforts to maintain fragile illusions. Genuine personal transformation occurs when an individual ceases futile attempts to resist the course of events, not out of a sense of hopelessness, but out of an awareness of the futility of the struggle. Abandoning control is not a sign of weakness, but rather providing an opportunity for something fundamentally new to emerge, unconstrained by the framework of personal will. It is a manifestation of faith in a certain higher wisdom that governs life experience. When this renunciation is sincere, what previously seemed chaotic and meaningless acquires coherence and logic. Circumstances develop favorably without visible effort, opportunities open up without persistent searching, and past anxiety transforms into a peaceful presence in the moment. To let go of a situation is not to abandon aspirations or turn away from the world. It is to free oneself from obsessive compulsion, to break free from the prison of obligation, and to embark on a path of conscious contemplation. When a person ceases to identify themselves with the object of their aspirations, they come closer to realizing their true essence. And it is at this moment, without unnecessary noise and fuss, that life begins to improve. But what if the obstacle to harmony is not attachment to another person, but the expectations and hopes that we place on them? Often, attachment is not simply an attraction to a specific individual, but rather a dependence on the qualities and roles that we assign to them. We project onto another person our dreams of salvation, the need for confirmation of our own significance, a role that they may never have sought to play. As Jung insightfully noted, we tend to notice in other people the traits that we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves in an idealized or distorted form. In this inaccurate reflection of reality, what we call attachment is born. The ego, driven by an insatiable thirst for control and universal recognition, seeks to subordinate the surrounding world, perceiving it as an extension of itself. Often, when we become attached to a specific person, a certain social status, or a set goal, it is not because they possess some absolute value in themselves, but because we unconsciously project onto them what we ourselves acutely lack. For example, an unquenchable thirst to be loved and accepted may manifest in the form of a painful emotional dependence on another person, and a deep-seated fear of being insignificant and unimportant to others, in the form of an obsessive preoccupation with achieving success at any cost. What at first glance seems like sincere love or healthy ambitions turns out to be only a desperate attempt to fill a gaping inner void. These psychological projections act like distorted lenses, distorting our perception of reality. Instead of seeing another person as they really are, with all their strengths and weaknesses, we see only what we desperately want to see. It is from this discrepancy between the desired and the actual that a feeling of deep frustration arises, because no one in the world is able to constantly play a role that is alien to them and does not correspond to their true essence. Attachment is nothing more than an illusory sense of symbiotic connection. If I can keep you close, if I can please you, if I can take you under my control, then I will feel complete and self-sufficient. However, this completeness is deceptive and extremely unstable, since it directly depends on the stability of something that is outside of our inner world, and therefore beyond our control. As Carl Jung aptly noted, the human psyche, resorting to the mechanism of projection, unconsciously tries to protect itself from encountering the content of the unconscious, which it is not yet ready to accept and integrate into its structure. It is much easier to believe that other people reject and do not accept us than to face the painful fear that perhaps we ourselves are not good enough. It is easier to blame the surrounding world for our inner voids and disappointments than to admit that we may have once abandoned an important part of ourselves, betrayed our true essence. Awareness of one's own projections opens the way to inner harmony and a rethinking of relationships. It is noticed that attachment is more due not to the qualities of another person, but to aspects of one's own personality that require attention. At this moment, a transformation of the perception of reality occurs. Another person ceases to be a reflection of personal needs, appearing as an independent personality. Freedom from projections is a complex but important process leading to honesty with oneself and the surrounding world. When an inflated ego strives for total control, this hinders conscious presence. Interaction with the world should be based not on the desire to possess, but on genuine connection. Failure to realize projections causes panic in the ego and an increased need to control the uncontrollable. There is a fundamental difference between having direction and having an obsessive desire to control everything. Having direction stems from inner order, while the need for control masks fear under the guise of competence. A person strives to anticipate, plan, and control every step, hoping to gain security. However, excessive control is just a manifestation of the ego seeking to avoid the inevitable uncertainty of life. As Jung said, neurosis is a substitute for genuine suffering. Control in this context acts as a painkiller. Instead of experiencing feelings, the mind engages in developing strategies. Sensitivity hides behind routine, goals, and promises, as if total control can protect from the pain inherent in human existence. The desire for total control over life only creates an illusion of security, imprisoning a person in an artificially created world. Attempts to eradicate unpredictability turn into the strangulation of spontaneity. that very spark that fills life with bright colors, freshness, and unadulterated truth. Relationships constrained by control become lifeless and mechanical. Professional activity turns into an unbearable burden, and everyday life, even full of activities, yawns with emptiness. An inflated ego, fueled by excessive ambitions, convinces that it is capable of coping with any challenges and must control every aspect of existence. It imposes rigid frameworks, dictating the only correct path, the ideal model for achieving success. And any deviation from these dogmas causes a painful sense of guilt, paralyzing fear, and merciless self-criticism. The mind, like an overloaded operating system, is forced to work non-stop, processing an immense amount of information. This results in mental and emotional exhaustion, a natural consequence of such a grueling mode of operation, and not a sign of personal weakness. Deep down, the desire for control is nothing more than a defense mechanism designed to protect against perceived subjugation. However, true surrender does not mean abandoning one's own goals and aspirations, but rather accepting the fact that there are forces in life and within ourselves that are beyond our control. Carl Jung viewed the unconscious as a living, autonomous entity actively involved in shaping reality. By ignoring this dimension, one condemns oneself to imprisonment in the dungeon of rational logic, naively believing that all problems can be solved solely at the level of thinking. Releasing excessive control is an act of trust, an acknowledgement of the wisdom hidden in chaos, and a realization that unpredictability can be a valuable life lesson. This is not a call to aimless existence, but an invitation to open up space for miracles, to allow life to surprise us. This is unlikely to happen if we strive to control even the silence. The stronger our desire for everything to go according to plan, the further we move away from our own essence. Conversely, the more we allow ourselves to listen, observe, and feel without constantly interfering, the clearer we become aware that life has its own unique rhythm, and this rhythm unfailingly leads us in the right direction. Perhaps true freedom lies not in striving for total control, but in providing the ego with the opportunity for transformation. This process of self-discovery occurs when the ego, exhausted by continuous attempts to control everything around it, begins to gradually loosen its grip, turning to the deeper aspects of the personality. The self, being the center of the psyche and the embodiment of the fullness of being, is not a social mask or role that one plays, but one's true I, manifested when one stops pretending. As long as the ego dominates, a person's life is built around external expectations and ideas about how they should behave, look, and conform to social norms. Liberation from these imposed ideas becomes the starting point on the path to returning to one's true essence. Carl Jung called this process individuation, meaning becoming who one truly is by integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the personality. This path is not a theoretical construct, but begins with small but significant changes in behavior and reactions. One stops automatically reacting according to old patterns and realizes that they are no longer obligated to maintain a certain role. The end of a relationship, for example, may not be a reason for immediately seeking a replacement, but an opportunity to face inner emptiness. These moments of liberation become a kind of portal, not promising immediate comfort, but opening up space for the manifestation of authenticity. True surrender begins when the ego recognizes its limits and realizes that it no longer has to pretend to be omnipotent and omniscient. At this moment, something new and quiet begins to emerge within a person. The self does not impose itself, does not demand attention, but guides a person with quiet clarity. Its guidance does not come from logical reasoning, but from inner agreement, from a feeling of resonance and meaning, even if it cannot always be immediately explained rationally. Conscious letting go, far from being inaction, represents a deeper level of involvement in life. It is action devoid of obsessive striving for results, love that does not require mandatory reciprocity, and creativity that does not need confirmation of its value. In this state, a person is driven not by the need for approval, but by an inner sense of harmony that does not seek external validation. In the process of individuation, the ego does not disappear but transforms, occupying a different position. Instead of claiming to possess the truth, it begins to serve the self. These internal changes affect all aspects of life. Interpersonal relationships become more sincere, decisions acquire deeper meaning, and life, which was previously perceived as a field for conquest, opens up as an experience to be lived. Letting go in this context is not a loss, but an integration, allowing what must leave to leave and giving the opportunity for what is ready to emerge to appear. It is at this moment that a person stops playing a role and begins to live a complete life. However, in order for the self to manifest, it is necessary to first get rid of another defense, the persona. According to Jung, the persona is the social mask we wear to be accepted by society. It is necessary because we live in a society. The problem arises when a person excessively identifies with this mask and begins to live by maintaining the created image rather than expressing their true essence, striving to appear strong, spiritual, successful, or exemplary. Each of these labels may sound appealing and even noble, but behind them lies a huge price. The constant need to control oneself to maintain the created image. This leads to exhaustion and, even worse, to alienation from oneself, as a person cannot be complete while living under the burden of constantly playing a role. Jung viewed the persona as a necessary but limited tool, as a bridge between the inner world and external reality. The problem arises when a person forgets about the existence of something greater, when the attachment to the image becomes so strong that any threat to its destruction causes fear, anger, and a defensive reaction. In this case, a person stops living and starts managing the impression they make on others. The process of liberation begins with the realization that there is no need to adhere to any constant life script. A person has the right to make mistakes, to change views, to be contradictory, to not conform to their yesterday's self. And it is only important to be sincere with oneself in the present moment. It is from this point that authenticity grows, even if it does not find universal approval. Abandoning the persona imposed by society or created by oneself is a radical step that requires courage to appear before the world without a mask, to allow oneself to be oneself, even if it means destroying the image that has been built for years. However, this act brings liberation, like an actor stepping off a poorly played stage and taking a deep breath, becoming the author of their own words. Carl Jung, a famous Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher, aptly noted, "Who looks outside, sleeps. Who looks inside, awakes." Attachment to a created image is a kind of obvious dream, a belief that we are only what we show to others. Awakening comes when a person turns their gaze inward and recognizes the complexity and multifaceted nature of their personality, which no persona can accommodate. And in this recognition, true life begins. Behind this mask lies what we are most afraid to see, the shadow. Freedom is frightening, although many strive for it. Few are willing to look it in the eye with honesty, because being free means losing the ability to hide behind other people's opinions, social roles, or illusory promises. This implies accepting responsibility for oneself, including those aspects of one's personality that we prefer to ignore. This is where the shadow resides. According to Jung, the shadow represents the repressed aspects of the psyche, everything that we reject, ignore, or consider unacceptable in ourselves. It is not necessarily evil, but rather what has been hidden because it did not correspond to the image of the ideal self that we created. The more we deny this part of ourselves, the more power it gains behind the scenes of our lives. A person bound by fear, even while declaring their thirst for freedom, often panics at the thought of what might come with it: emptiness, silence, the absence of confirmation of their significance. Therefore, they frantically cling to another person, job, or idealized future, not out of love, but out of fear of what will appear when everything on which their life was based disappears. It is at this moment that separation turns into a painful process, because letting go means not just freeing oneself from the external, but also looking deep within oneself. What remains when hopes are dashed, what arises after the end of a relationship, the collapse of plans, and the destruction of ideals. In this naked space, the shadow manifests itself, and it does so very insistently. Sometimes it appears in the form of anger, envy, deep sorrow, feelings that a person does not want to admit. However, it takes considerable courage to go through this difficult period without trying to embellish reality. As Jung said, enlightenment is impossible without encountering the dark sides of the soul. It is in this transition that the transformation of personality takes place. When an individual ceases to fear their shadow, it loses its power over them. They begin to integrate these forgotten parts of themselves, needs, fears, vulnerability, as integral aspects of their personality, not to submit to them, but to consciously manage them. At this moment, letting go ceases to be simply an act of liberation from another person, but becomes an encounter with what was previously rejected. The shadow is not what prevents one from living a full life, but what must be accepted in order to attain fullness of being. Only those who pass through this inner space with honesty will be able to feel true freedom, independent of anything but themselves. But how does this elusive shadow manifest in the areas where you'd least expect it, namely in relationships that are typically referred to as love? Often, people tend to confuse genuine love with a common human need. A fine line exists between the sincere desire to share life with another person and the irrational fear of loneliness, yet it is this line that determines the colossal difference between these two concepts. As the eminent psychologist Carl Jung asserted, true love arises only where all kinds of projections end. As long as a person is attached to the image that another person represents in their eyes, they are unable to see their real essence and often do not see themselves either. At the dawn of a relationship, it is quite natural for idealization of the partner to arise, artfully disguised as a bright feeling. A person projects onto another their hopes for emotional salvation, the need for security, and even the desire to find a sense of identity, thereby not realizing how they are creating dependence. In this situation, the other person ceases to be a person with their own merits and demerits, turning into a faceless role of function. It is then that fear, cloaked in the garments of love, replaces tenderness and intimacy, fear of loss, fear of not being good enough, fear of facing reality. A person believes that the other must constantly be around so that they can feel good, and in the event of distance, they feel as if they are falling apart. But love that enslaves instead of binding is not love, but merely a painful need. Such a connection is not a strong bond, but rather a contract based on mutual insecurity and fears. What happens when we break free from these bonds? Often we discover true love for the person, but also the realization that they served as a kind of barrier, protecting us from unaccepted aspects of our own personality. In this context, letting go does not mean ending love. Rather, it is the beginning of love in its purest form, when another person is given the right to exist outside the bounds of constant emotional dependence. This is love devoid of possessiveness, a relationship with a real person, not an idealized image created in our imagination. This approach requires maturity and recognition of the other person's freedom, their ability to change and even leave, while maintaining respect and warm feelings for them. This entails an inner transformation. Instead of seeking the missing part of ourselves in another person, we find support within ourselves, a foundation for love that does not lead to self-loss. Love that does not strive for possession is not cold or detached. On the contrary, it becomes more fulfilling, free from fear, calm, yet deep. It is a state when I is not erased, when two people exist together without dissolving into each other, but sharing their fullness. When projections disappear, real relationships begin. Imperfect, but real. A meeting of two minds that do not destroy or absorb each other, but get to know each other, allowing themselves to love freely. However, maintaining this carefully constructed game, based on pretense and dependence on the opinions of others, does not go unnoticed. It drains our life energy. Inevitably, a moment comes when this complex structure begins to crack. The carefully created image, designed to meet social expectations, demands, and established patterns, begins to gradually collapse. The strength that seemed to stem from the ability to control the situation turns into an unbearable burden, and the fatigue that masqueraded as physical exhaustion exposes its true cause: ego exhaustion. This exhaustion is not a manifestation of laziness or weakness, but rather a quiet but persistent cry of the unconscious, a forced pause, as if some inner voice desperately signals, "There is no more strength to pretend." It is at this moment that the true self begins to manifest, not accompanied by euphoria, but rather by a special sense of peace that comes with the completion of something. Carl Jung viewed such crises as desperate calls for truth. When a person's inner life becomes disorganized, it is often a harbinger of an upcoming reorganization on a deeper level. Emotional burnout, so common in the modern world, can be interpreted not only as a consequence of an excess of external stimuli, but also as an overabundance of social roles, an excessive number of expectations, and insufficient alignment with one's own feelings and needs. A life devoted to maintaining a certain image requires a continuous influx of energy. It is necessary to carefully weigh every word, control emotions and reactions, and constantly be in a state of heightened alertness. But when the body refuses to obey, when the mind becomes clouded, when the will to act disappears, something inside urgently demands attention. Who are you without all this superficiality? In this critical moment, letting go becomes a real alternative, not as an escape from problems, but as a liberation from chains. One realizes that there is no longer a need to extort approval to prove one's worth. There appears an opportunity to stop and not disappear into oblivion, but, on the contrary, to begin to manifest more sincerely and truthfully. The ego desperately resists this process, fearing that without constant effort everything will collapse. However, submitting to circumstances is not capitulation, but a manifestation of mental maturity, a recognition of the existence of boundaries, and an understanding that attempts to forcibly overcome them lead only to devastation. Jung argued that the ignored psyche manifests through symptoms, while the heard one opens new paths. Weariness from wearing a mask is an invitation to a sincere sigh outside the imposed role, to questioning what truly matters, and to acknowledging that sometimes, before moving on, one simply needs to rest, to shed the burden of constant performance, and to allow something genuinely sincere to be born in this space of silence and peace. When a person fails, they are haunted by a deep sorrow, often remaining in the shadow of public attention, a longing for the opportunities and lives that never materialized. Much is said about the liberating power of letting go, but rarely is the pain that accompanies this process addressed, because letting go is a kind of demise, not physical, but deeply symbolic and sometimes just as agonizing. Parting with a dream of a relationship with plans for the future is experiencing grief for what did not become reality, and this grief is quite palpable. Carl Jung viewed suffering not as an annoying mistake requiring immediate correction, but as a necessary stage on the path to transformation. Without the destruction of the old, there can be no birth of the new. This law applies both to external circumstances and to internal experiences. When the time comes to part with something, with a failed plan, with a faded love, with an outdated identity, a rupture inevitably occurs, and each such rupture, even dictated by necessity, causes pain. In this context, letting go is not a cold-blooded rational decision, but a complex emotional process that often leads us to quiet havens of reflection and doubt. When the support on which the world rested collapses, a gaping void arises. And although this void holds the potential for growth and renewal, it instills fear. Conflicting feelings struggle in the soul: relief and sadness, freedom and loneliness, courage and timidity. All of these are components of the heartache caused not only by the loss itself, but also by the collapse of the supported image, the ideas of how everything should have been, and the unfulfilled inner scenario. In moments of shattered hopes, when expectations are not met, The ego craves explanations, seeks the reasons for failure, strives to understand why the desired did not become reality. However, the deep processes of the self unfold according to different laws, non-linear and multifaceted. It often happens that it is precisely unfulfilled dreams and plans that become a powerful impetus for self-analysis, forcing a reconsideration of established values and strengthening the inner foundation. They are like interrupting a scenario that seemed familiar and understandable, but in reality no longer corresponds to the true needs of the individual. Recognizing and experiencing grief from such losses is of great importance. It is important not to avoid pain, but to go through it, recognizing its existence in order to gain the ability to transform. This is not about cultivating suffering, but about taking an honest look at it, consciously. Experienced pain has its time, and during this time important maturation processes take place in the depths of the soul. The ability to let go is the art of dealing with invisible losses, those that leave no visible traces, but deeply wound the heart. It is in these inconspicuous emotional scars that new life is born, not as a guarantee, but as a potential. When the bonds that tied us to the past finally dissolve, something amazing happens. The world does not collapse, but rebuilds itself. The silence that previously caused anxiety becomes a source of inspiration, and the emptiness that instilled fear turns into a space of opportunity. It is in this zone, freed from shackles, that the shoots of the new begin to bloom, previously impossible under conditions of total control, obsessive expectations, and deafening noise. It's akin to opening a window locked for many years when dust particles playfully swirl in the rays of light and the air is filled with the freshness of change. At first, the sensation is unusual, causing some discomfort in the silence, but gradually the breath is restored, returning the feeling of fullness of life. The mind, weary of the endless race, finally listens to itself, to the needs of the body, to the passage of time, to the subtle signs of fate. Imagine a person who has spent years in a relationship devoid of genuine exchange, held there by fear, attachment, or ingrained habit. When this person, gathering their courage, lets go not only of their partner but also of the unattainable hope for continuation, they are struck by a deafening silence and an all-consuming emptiness. However, following this darkness, an unfilled space emerges, offering a chance for rebirth. And so they pick up the pen again, create culinary masterpieces without compulsion, feel the need for solitary walks, enjoy music in the dark, and perform actions that do not require anyone's approval. This is a return to creativity, not as an obligation, but as a means of self-expression, as an opportunity to share what is most intimate. Carl Jung proposed the idea of a psychic energy that is released and restored when a person stops directing efforts toward maintaining their ego. All the resources previously spent on strengthening the persona, trying to control the course of events, or denying reality become available for use, and this released energy demands an outlet. At this moment, creative potential is born, manifesting not only in art but also in the existential sphere. Creativity is understood not only as the creation of artistic works, but also as the rethinking and transformation of one's own life, carried out with full awareness. This can be expressed in changing the environment in the house, revising the usual daily routine, or transforming past suffering into valuable life experience and wisdom. The creative process begins when a person stops automatically reacting to external stimuli and begins to consciously choose their path. This becomes possible only with an inner space where intuition can manifest itself fully. What was previously suppressed by fears and doubts now sounds clear and distinct. A person begins to see the interconnections between phenomena that previously seemed like insurmountable problems. Inspiration can come suddenly, for example, while taking a shower, and answers to complex questions are found effortlessly after long days of intense searching. A person stops looking for solutions through logical thinking and begins to trust their feelings to see new perspectives. Over time, the perception of reality also changes. Each day lived ceases to seem like an arena of continuous battles, and the slowing down of the pace of life occurs not because of external slowness, but thanks to the attainment of inner harmony and consonance with oneself. Making decisions becomes a simpler and more natural process, as the need to prove anything to others disappears. It is noteworthy that goals and opportunities that previously seemed unattainable begin to appear in sight, as if on their own, and this happens not by magic but because a person stops creating obstacles in their own path. As an example, consider the situation of a creative person experiencing internal stagnation. An artist, striving to create something genius, places impossibly high demands on themselves, which ultimately paralyzes their creative process. However, one day, in a state of extreme exhaustion, they decide to let go of the situation, temporarily abandon work on the project, allow themselves a break, go for a walk, or even on a spontaneous trip. And it is in this atmosphere of apparent inaction that a new idea is born, spontaneous, full of life, and free from any pressure. This is the true power of letting go. When a person frees themselves from obsessive thoughts and expectations, what is truly valuable to them either returns to their life or gets the opportunity to manifest. This state of free creativity, of unity with one's own essence, is the complete opposite of the logic of the ego. The ego strives for total control, craves guarantees and impressive results, while the self seeks only self-expression, truth, and harmony. When the ego recedes into the background, the self takes on the role of a guide, leading a person through life with ease and grace. It does not compel or force, but only indicates directions, manifesting through what brings pleasure and satisfaction, even if it goes unnoticed by others and does not bring immediate results. In moments of farewell to the past, the true beauty of liberation is revealed. This is not simply a loss, but rather a transformation, like a bridge connecting the experienced with the potential opportunities of the future. A person leaves behind the desire for proof and finds their authentic self. Liberation returns one to oneself, freeing one from the superfluous, artificial, and unnecessary burden. The space that emerges after liberation should not evoke fear, but rather be perceived as fertile ground, awaiting genuine presence. In this silence, life does not shout, but whispers, and the internally cleansed person begins to listen attentively. Ultimately, it all comes down to a simple gesture, opening the palm and releasing imaginations, fears, and repetitive scenarios. This happens not from exhaustion, although sometimes it becomes the starting point, but from the realization that holding on costs more than the loss itself. Attachment, despite its seeming familiarity, is not true love. It stems from fear, lack, and attempts to hold on to something that may have already fulfilled its function. To love is to allow another to exist and life to flow its course, even if it does not meet personal expectations. Control is not a sign of strength, but a subtle form of resistance. It is the ego striving to subordinate reality to its desires. But such a life turns into constant tension and conflict with the present, which is unbearable for the soul. Carl Jung, a prominent thinker, argued that true healing comes not through imposed changes, but through deep acceptance of existing reality. This is the moment when a person stops the exhausting struggle with the flow of life and begins to listen carefully to its wise voice. Abandoning the fruitless pursuit of illusory ideals and boldly facing the present is the path to transformation. Acceptance is by no means a surrender. On the contrary, it is an open door through which genuine transformation enters our lives. In this regard, the key question becomes, what are we desperately clinging to? What outdated image, what person from the past, or what unfulfilled expectation still occupies a precious place in our heart, preventing the arrival of fresh opportunities? What will happen if we finally break free from these shackles and allow ourselves to breathe freely? Letting go certainly involves risk, but holding on can be even more dangerous. Often being held captive by illusions and obsolete connections is much more destructive than the fear of the unknown. After all, our purpose is not to play an imposed role, but to live a full, rich life. And such a life requires courage, the courage to shed the masks that no longer correspond to our true essence, the courage to approach what is truly important, the courage to simply be ourselves. Authentic life begins where the illusion of control ends. It is in this quiet, intimate point that we return to our true selves, not as an unattainable ideal, but as a living presence, and then everything that has true value finds its way into our lives on its own.